Imagine two of the most powerful pastors in America, Bishop T.D. Jakes and Bishop Noel Jones. One standing shoulder to shoulder as respected leaders of faith, but behind closed doors, a storm was brewing that almost tore their ministries apart. For years, whispers filled church halls, conference rooms, and even media circles. Talk of jealousy, betrayal, and rivalry spreading like wildfire. You won't believe how deep this tension went, because what seemed like mutual respect on stage was often followed by cold silence backstage. Both men were at the top of their game, leading thousands of people, influencing millions through television and books, yet somewhere between fame and faith, their relationship had fractured. Let me tell you, the story of how these two giants went from brothers in ministry to bitter rivals is more shocking than anyone could have imagined. T.D. Jakes had come from humble beginnings, born in South Charleston, West Virginia. He wasn't born into wealth or fame, but had a burning passion to preach the word. In the early 1980s, he started with only a few church members, but his dynamic sermons and emotional delivery drew people in like a magnet. His rise was meteoric, and soon he moved to Dallas, Texas, founding the Potter's House, a megachurch that grew to over 30,000 members and turned into a global brand. He became not just a preacher, but also an author, a filmmaker, and a voice of hope heard in homes across the world. On the other side, Noel Jones had a different path. Born in Spanish Town, Jamaica, into a family with a strong spiritual legacy, he carried the weight of his father's name. His preaching style was sharp, intellectual, and magnetic, pulling people from every background to his church in Los Angeles. Soon, City of Refuge Church became a spiritual hub for celebrities, athletes, and influential figures who admired Jones's insight and charisma. By the late 1990s, these two men had risen to unbelievable fame, and with fame came comparisons. People started debating who was the better preacher, who had more influence, and who spoke more powerfully. At first, it seemed like normal conversation in the church world. But this is where it gets interesting, because those comparisons soon became whispers of rivalry. Organizers of big conferences were often forced to choose between them for headline spots. Pastors and members began to take sides, and social media, though still young at the time, only made the competition more obvious. But here's the shocking part. Insiders claimed this wasn't just about ego. Some said there were business disputes tied to book deals, partnerships, and speaking engagements. Others hinted at personal slights and moments of betrayal that both men never fully addressed. What made this story different was that it wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a spiritual war happening in the public eye, one that threatened to divide entire congregations. Noel Jones was often seen as the bold, unpredictable preacher who challenged traditions, while Jakes was considered the polished empire builder with influence that reached far beyond the pulpit. The media fed into these narratives, sometimes portraying Jones as the rebel and Jakes as the establishment. But behind the headlines, emotions were raw and real. Jones reportedly felt overlooked at times, believing his voice was just as important as Jakes, while Jakes felt the weight of constant criticism, accused of commercializing ministry. The craziest part was that many church leaders tried to mediate, but every attempt seemed to fail. Each new conference, each media headline, and each subtle comment from the pulpit only added fuel to the fire. What had started as mutual respect had now become a cold rivalry, and though they were careful with their words in public, those closest to them knew something was deeply broken. And destiny took an unexpected turn when one conference in the early 2000s became the stage for a silent but explosive fallout between the two, one that no one in the audience fully understood, but many would talk about for years. The tension between Bishop T.D. Jakes and Bishop Noel Jones had now reached a point where it was impossible to ignore. What started as whispers and quiet comparisons had grown into a visible divide that was shaking the church world. People noticed when the two stopped appearing together on conference lineups. Their absence from each other's events was no coincidence. Behind the scenes, their relationship was strained, and although they never openly attacked each other, their silence spoke louder than words. Let me tell you, this wasn't just a disagreement over theology or leadership style. It was a feud rooted in pride, hurt, and misunderstandings that neither man was ready to admit. While their congregations admired them as spiritual giants, those closest to them could see the cracks forming. This is where it gets interesting because during this time, many believed these men had everything, a massive following, influence, and wealth. But even with all of that, bitterness was quietly eating away at a friendship that had once inspired others. At a major conference in the early 2000s, the growing divide finally became clear to everyone behind the curtain. Both men were scheduled to speak, but what happened backstage was far more dramatic than anything that happened on stage. Sources close to the situation said there were tense discussions over who would take the main speaking slot, a position both men were often used to holding. While the details of that night were never fully revealed, those present described the atmosphere as thick with tension. The conference organizers were left scrambling, trying to prevent what could have turned into a public embarrassment. Although neither pastor spoke negatively about the other in front of the crowd, their cold exchange backstage was enough to signal that their friendship had shattered. From that day on, the distance between them grew, and their feud became one of the most talked about topics in church leadership circles. What makes this story different is that this wasn't just about two pastors competing for attention. Their conflict became symbolic of something much larger. The struggle between different approaches to ministry, fame, and influence. Jakes had built a massive global platform, appearing on television and in movies, while Jones was admired for his sharp mind and unique preaching style that resonated with thinkers and artists. Their differences, instead of complementing one another, became points of tension. This rivalry didn't just impact them, it began to divide their supporters. People started choosing sides, debating who was the better preacher or who carried the greater anointing. Social media amplified every rumor, and stories began circulating about personal slights and private disagreements, painting one as the victim and the other as the villain, depending on who was telling the story. But here's the shocking part. Some insiders claimed this feud was never really about ministry at all. There were whispers of deeper issues, hurt feelings over perceived disrespect, jealousy over influence in certain leadership circles, and even tension tied to financial opportunities connected to book deals and speaking engagements. Whether these rumors were true or exaggerated, they only fueled the divide further. Both pastors became careful with their public image, rarely acknowledging each other, and avoiding events where they might be forced to interact. What once was a brotherly bond turned into a cold war, with both men focusing on their own ministries and pretending the other didn't exist. The craziest part was that despite their silence, the church world couldn't stop talking about them. Every sermon they preached, every move they made was analyzed for hidden meaning, and the speculation only grew louder. Behind closed doors, there were quiet attempts to fix things. Mutual friends, church leaders, and even family members tried to mediate, arranging private meetings that often ended without resolution. Both men were strong-willed, proud, and deeply protective of their ministries, making it difficult to let their guard down. These meetings, instead of bringing peace, sometimes made things worse because old wounds were brought back up without healing. In one particularly tense meeting, emotions ran high as Jones expressed his frustration at being overshadowed, while Jakes defended himself, explaining the heavy burdens he carried as a leader constantly in the spotlight. Voices were raised and tempers flared, but this raw confrontation would later prove to be an important step toward healing. At that moment, however, neither man was ready to reconcile, and their feud continued to simmer in the background of every conference and church event. And destiny was already setting the stage for something neither of them could have predicted: a turning point that would completely change the story of their relationship. As the years passed, the feud between Bishop T.D. Jakes and Bishop Noel Jones remained one of the most talked about controversies in church circles. Yet, neither man spoke about it publicly. They carried on with their ministries as if nothing was wrong, but those close to them knew the truth. Their once strong friendship had become a silent rivalry, and every shared stage they avoided only made people more curious. Behind the scenes, both men were privately carrying heavy burdens. T.D. Jakes, though celebrated as a global leader, was exhausted from managing the Potter's House, his media empire, and the constant demands of fame. Every sermon, every appearance came with pressure, criticism, and expectations that would drain even the strongest leader. Let me tell you, despite his commanding presence, Jakes was quietly dealing with sleepless nights, spiritual battles, and the stress of holding up an empire that seemed larger than life. Noel Jones, on the other hand, was fighting his own private struggles. Leading a massive Los Angeles church filled with celebrities, athletes, and influential figures wasn't easy. People saw him as bold, confident, and untouchable, but the reality was far more complex. Jones was carrying emotional exhaustion, health scares, and loneliness that he rarely spoke about. Rumors about his personal life added to the weight, and even though he smiled from the pulpit, he was wrestling with pain that few people understood. This is where it gets interesting because while their rivalry played out silently in public, both men were facing battles that made them question everything. They had become symbols of power and influence in ministry, but behind closed doors, they were simply two men under immense pressure, both yearning for peace. During this time, their feud felt permanent. Church leaders had stopped trying to bring them together because every attempt seemed to fail. Yet, destiny took an unexpected turn when both men found themselves at the same spiritual leadership conference. Neither had planned to interact, but circumstances forced them into the same breakout session, and what happened there would change everything. The session was about vulnerability in leadership, a topic both men knew all too well. As they sat in the same room, surrounded by other pastors, a speaker encouraged them to share their personal struggles. Jakes was the first to speak, and his words stunned the room. He admitted to feeling isolated despite his fame, to carrying a weight so heavy that it sometimes made him question if he could keep going. His voice trembled as he shared the unseen side of leadership, the loneliness, the exhaustion, and the emotional toll of always being the strong one. When it was Noel Jones's turn, he opened up in a way few had ever seen. He spoke about the pain of constant comparison, how every sermon he preached was measured against others, and how rumors and criticism had left him feeling deeply misunderstood. He admitted that years of rivalry had taken a toll on his spirit, and he carried regrets about how far things had gone. The atmosphere in that room shifted. Pastors who once saw them as untouchable leaders now saw them as human. The craziest part was that for the first time, Jakes and Jones looked at each other not as competitors, but as two men fighting the same battle. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, but it was the crack in the wall that years of division had built between them. After that moment, something shifted. They didn't suddenly become friends again, but the bitterness began to fade. They both left that conference with a new perspective, quietly reflecting on the pain their feud had caused, not just to themselves, but to the church community that looked up to them. Slowly, private conversations started happening. Mutual friends encouraged them to talk, and this time, instead of shutting down the idea, they both agreed. Those early conversations were careful, sometimes awkward, but they were a start. And here's the shocking part. This process of healing didn't begin with apologies or dramatic speeches. It began with two powerful men finally admitting they were hurting. They started to see that their feud wasn't just about ego. It was about years of miscommunication, pride, and the pressure of being leaders constantly in the spotlight. What came next would take this story from quiet reconciliation to a public display of humility that would shock the church world. Months after that quiet breakthrough, whispers started spreading in church circles that something unexpected was happening. T.D. Jakes and Noel Jones were speaking again. At first, no one believed it. For years, their feud had seemed unbreakable, a cold war that symbolized division in the church world. But then came the moment that silenced every rumor. Both men showed up at the same high-profile ministry event, and instead of avoiding each other as they had always done, they walked onto the stage together. The audience was stunned. Cameras flashed, people gasped, and social media exploded within minutes. But this wasn't some staged publicity stunt. What people were witnessing was the result of years of pain, growth, and a decision that shocked even their closest friends. They had chosen reconciliation. When Bishop Jakes took the microphone, his voice carried the same authority he was known for, but this time there was a vulnerability in his tone. He spoke about forgiveness not in a general sense, but as a man who had lived through pride, hurt, and misunderstanding. Without saying Jones's name at first, he admitted that for too long, he had allowed bitterness to shape his actions. As he spoke, tears welled up in his eyes, and that massive arena grew completely silent. Then, in front of thousands of people, he turned to Bishop Noel Jones and extended his hand. It wasn't just a handshake, it was a moment of humility, a gesture that said more than any words could. Noel Jones, known for his sharp wit and bold personality, was visibly emotional as well. He took the microphone and confessed that he too had allowed pride and pain to build walls between them. He admitted that he had struggled with resentment, but he was ready to let it go. The crowd erupted in cheers and tears as the two men embraced a powerful image of grace and redemption. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a moment that sent shockwaves through the entire faith community. People who had been divided over their feud were now witnessing something rare. Two powerful leaders choosing peace over pride and forgiveness over years of silent rivalry. But here's what most people didn't see. The reconciliation didn't end on that stage. After that event, Jakes and Jones began meeting privately, rebuilding a friendship brick by brick. They spoke openly about their mistakes, the pain of ministry, and the pressure that had driven them apart. Their conversations weren't always easy, but they were honest. Over time, they started supporting each other again, even appearing at conferences together, something that would have been unimaginable years before. Their story became a powerful reminder that even the most broken relationships can be restored when humility enters the room. What made this story so powerful wasn't just the drama of their feud, but the redemption that followed. For years, people had watched their rivalry as a form of entertainment, but now they were witnessing healing on a level that many never expected. Pastors across the nation began using their story as an example of why forgiveness is so vital, not just in ministry, but in every relationship. And though neither Jakes nor Jones openly shared every detail of what happened behind the scenes, their actions spoke louder than words. They had proven that real strength isn't in holding grudges, but in laying them down. In the end, the feud that once divided the church world became a testimony of restoration. It showed that even leaders at the highest level are human, capable of hurt, but also capable of change. Their reconciliation didn't just heal a friendship, it inspired thousands of people who had been watching from the sidelines. What started as a bitter rivalry ended as a story of redemption, leaving a lasting legacy that reminded the world of a simple yet powerful truth. Forgiveness changes everything.